Hello and welcome to Authors Die Twice, a podcast about video games and aesthetic theory hosted by two living failures. Today we're joined by a very special guest, Debbie Urbanski, who's the author of the novel Afterworld, actually Afterworld, a novel, and the very recent collection of stories Portalmania. So we're going to talk today about some of Debbie's work, I think about games a little bit, and also about The Wall by Marlen Haushofer. But first of all, welcome, Debbie, and thanks so much for joining us. We're excited about this conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me.
So I think I'll just start off maybe with a couple of, pretty general comments about Afterworld because I just came off a semester teaching it in a couple slightly different courses. So when I originally reached out, I think I was in the middle of teaching the novel with like my kind of my what I would call maybe my best students, right? The students who are most like engaged, responsive, you know, thinking through the ideas, and some of them ended up writing about it for their final papers. But the thing that really struck me reading it again this time, and especially interacting with students around it, is the what I would call like just a very game-like quality of the novel, right? Like it really feels like the rules to read it, or kind of the key to reading it, is revealed over time. And I wonder, I guess I wanted to just open up by asking you to, if you'd maybe say a little bit about what your inspirations were or methods for actually writing the novel, for setting it up in the way that you do. I know that's a pretty broad question, but hopefully that can get us into it a little bit.
Sure, sure. So originally, the novel structure was just a bunch of documents that people had to. My idea was that people would have to piece them together. So there wasn't a cohesive narrator. AI wasn't really part of it. I really liked the idea of the reader needing to play an active part to understand what was happening. I love books like House of Leaves, where you kind of need to figure out what's going on and piece things together. And I like books that feel real as well. So I like the primary source document idea. One of my first agents, I've had a bunch of them, but my first agent thought the book needed to be a little easier for the reader. That's kind of been an ongoing theme. So I'm glad that you thought that I wrote down what you said. The key to reading it is revealed over time, because I think that was the goal of my editor and probably agents, is to originally I wanted to make things super difficult for the reader, and that probably wasn't commercially viable, at least with a bigger publisher. So I was kind of nudged over time to like this middle ground where I think my editor used the word signposts, or kind of giving some handholds or footholds to the reader, so that they can make sense of it more on their own. I'm glad that it reads like a game though too, because I might have mentioned this in our emails. Games were a huge part of it. I took most of it out in the end, but originally I was very interested in thinking what games and art too, would we be creating in our final generation? And like if we knew humanity was going to go extinct, what would we do for entertainment? And what kind of like what games say about us, the kind of games that we play, and also game reviews. So I actually had created games and then written reviews of those games, and then I took it all out. But I was thinking a lot about games when I first was writing it.
Just to go off of that again for a second, especially this kind of like the experience of at least trying to teach my students how to read the novel, I guess, because they, a lot of them were like, I don't know what's going on. They would frequently tell me this. And so I started, I think, the first day by asking them where they think the novel actually begins, because like there's this bit of like, there's your sort of dedication, then there's like a bit of source code, and then there's level zero, and then eventually there's like a page that seems like, the first page proper of the novel that we're reading that gives us all kind of really the key to like how to understand the temporality of it and the timeline. And so it truly made me think of like, flipping back to a menu or a guide, or reading a little blurb, lore thing in a game or something like that. And I think that books, I mean, it's been a while, I guess, since I've had to do that with a novel, like to actually turn back to the first page pretty frequently to figure out, in a way that's not just, remembering the first line or remembering the characters' names, but actually like understanding how the various pieces of the work are arranged. I know that's something that still like really strikes me about the novel, right? Of like having to always be going back, which that repetition is something that, of course, is huge in games. And I don't know, I just love that aspect of the novel.
Sure, sure. Yeah, and I imagine that I really love rereading. And I just finished The Employees by Olga Rav. I can't remember if we talked about that, but that was a also a book that felt like at the beginning, I have no idea what's going on. I was very disoriented. I didn't really connect with the book, but I kind of dragged myself through it. I fell in love with it. And then I started immediately over. And it's like you're reading a whole new book sometimes. I felt that way with The Wall too, actually, which I know we'll talk about later. But I love that experience. I feel like that second read or even the third read is where I really understand a book.
I'll just add here that I was also really struck by the difficulty. I mean, difficulty is a central preoccupation for me in like my actual sort of day job. But I have to say I went into this book, not knowing very much about speculative fiction, particularly like, contemporary sort of climate novels and AI novels and sci-fi in a way. Um, and I was just immediately struck by like, yeah, like this feels like, I study modernism, so I was like, this feels like a modernist novel, and I wonder, you can correct me on this because I don't know the archive or the tradition very well, but I don't I wouldn't normally associate a kind of like sentence level or like chapter level, or rather simply formal difficulty and resistance with the speculative fiction genre. I mean, I just let me just say, Debbie, like I'm also like I want to echo Brian in saying that I'm just thrilled and honored to have you to have a chance to speak with you here on the pod. And I was really shaken by Afterworld. Like I loved the book and it kind of got its hooks in me in the kind of I imagine myself, maybe in a self-serving or false way, but as a fairly dispassionate reader in many cases. And this was a book that just kind of emotionally, like really, really, really stuck with me. So maybe, I can share more about that later. But just thinking about the difficulty, I had two initial thoughts. So one is just you mentioned your conversations with your agent, and just want to flag the way that the words what were they? Signposts, footholds, and handholds sound very appropriate, thematically appropriate to someone like Sen, patrolling around or hiking around the woods or trekking around the woods or trekking around the forest. Um, but also thinking about one way in which that difficulty manifests for me, not just in like in how the parts fit together, but also just on the like what Brian and you both referred to as a kind of game-like style storytelling. I was really interested in the ways in which the novel delivers narrative information purely through space or setting. So this is like captured in really extreme, in the sort of extreme or purified form when we just, get that description of the cabin and we just get a rundown of everything in the cabin or the moments where we have these long inventory lists that are just in sort of excruciating almost detail telling us, just notating objects that are present to the character or related to the characters. Um, and it did struck me that this is something very close to what in video game design they call environmental storytelling. Have you heard of this term at all? It's like a kind of
No.
gamer. Yeah, so environmental storytelling is just that. It's a way of delivering information, narrative information purely through space rather than through any kind of narration or any kind of dialogue. Um, and so it's exactly this. It's exactly walking into a space, because games, you're often just simply inhabiting space over and above any story that's being delivered, right? Or even any combat you're doing or platforms you're jumping on. And as you enter this room or the space, you infer simply what kind of narrative chronology or narrative events um, you reconstruct it or infer it through the simple layout and contents of a space. And that's actually a pretty difficult process at times, even though it's sort of become centralized or become a buzzword in an incredibly mass market, sort of industrialized entertainment industry. Um, and so this book felt like almost like pure environmental storytelling, not to mention the fact that it's also about the environment, so it's like environmental storytelling in multiple ways. So I really loved that, even though I found it, at times like, man, I'm having to work a lot here to like just read through these descriptions and think about what each item implies, right? Or if it implies anything at all. So I loved that aspect of the book.
Yeah, I'm glad the book is still difficult because I was worried, I wanted it to be even more difficult. And all along, again, my agent editor were like, it's still gonna be hard for the reader. I felt like with the post-apocalyptic genre, I love that genre. I'm a big reader in it, but I also worry about that being a form of entertainment in a way where we're talking about like, you know, millions of humans generally die, lots and lots and lots of people die. The earth is wasted. And sometimes I feel like we as in like the larger culture only can read for pure escapism and entertainment these days. So I felt it was really important because of the subject matter, to make a book that the reader is going to have to work and feel uncomfortable too. Um, and I like that idea of environmental storytelling too. That feels right to what I was trying to do on a lot of levels. Where first, I think that's how from my understanding, if a AI was going to describe, especially earlier AIs, which I was basing my narrator on, was going to describe a room, they wouldn't necessarily be aware of what's important in it. So I wanted the reader to kind of be able to play a role in figuring out what's important here. I also really, really love lists, and I am interested in telling stories and narrative in untraditional ways. So, like, the book kind of started, the first piece of writing I really did for it was an incomplete list of things we tried, which is somewhere in the middle of it. But I wrote that as I wanted to see if it could still be a story, and it's debatable whether it's a story, but if I could write a story in the form of a list going from human extinction to now, and or like story as dictionary entries. That was another challenge I was interested in.
And that's another game like way, I mean, not, but like sort of separate from, the kind of like artistic motivation that's happening on the page here. Like that's a totally another game like way of telling stories, which is maybe less environmental storytelling, but certainly gamey storytelling, which is essentially what in the industry is called like audio logs or files, where again, instead of having a narrator or having dialogue or cutscenes, you explore a space and you find letters, right? You'll find actually a dictionary, or a newspaper, and that gives you a snapshot of sort of the human life world or like culture, or definitions or concepts at a specific moment in time. Usually it's rather crude in games, by necessity, but yeah, I mean, I love the dictionary sections and reading those, I was like, man, I feel like I'm playing BioShock or something. Like, I feel like I'm playing one of these games. It's like the elevated sort of like ideas driven version of that.
That's awesome. Yeah, I used to play a lot of games in like high school, and it's probably where it ended. But I did do so while I was thinking about games as I was writing this book, I watched a lot of game trailers and some game walkthroughs and read a lot of game reviews. I read some books about games, but I really loved like there was a game everybody's gone to the Rapture
Yeah.
where you're kind of I actually might want to play that one someday, but first I thought it was gorgeous, but then I just loved the idea of you're just presented with this space and you I guess that maybe is environmental storytelling. You're presented with the space and you have to figure out what happened and piece together the story.
Speaking of lists, and I'll I guess not mention by name, but one of my students volunteered bravely to read this out loud in class. There's this list of what Dana and Sen leave behind when they abandon their house, and it's just this page long paragraph that includes, I mean, it's just a, monotonous, mundane list, right? It's something that you could look at and then realize that you need to skip it over or something like that, if you're trying to read the book quickly, because there was even, I realized there were some repetitions of, the same objects will be mentioned once or twice in there too. And it's a lot of domestic things and without even getting into what this paragraph is doing, it strikes me that a lot of what's happening in the novel, and this is, I wonder maybe how you approach this when you're writing, but also how you maybe conceive of this as you're reading, just as a reader of fiction. But a lot of the novel seems to always be sort of playing with maybe the boundary between what is narratively important versus what isn't narratively important, right? Like what could just be summarized or skipped over versus what you essentially need to read very closely and slow down and even read it out loud, sometimes to actually get what it's doing, right? And those I felt were, or those kind of two, I don't know, seemingly opposing things seem to like really not be opposed. And I guess I just wonder if you can maybe talk about that a little bit and how that's working in the novel.
So the idea of playing with the boundaries of what's narratively important versus what's not, traditionally, is that
Sure. Yeah, that's maybe one way to put it. Yeah.
okay? I so um I don't like I don't like a lot of the rules I have been told over the years about writing and uh I I appreciate really slow books and books that kind of go against this idea of again the idea of entertainment. Like we always need to worry, what if the reader gets bored, or like we have to keep the reader's attention because they can't. I'm not going to say anything mean about readers, but like I guess I grew up as a kid reading both, and I mentioned this in the dedication, Stephen King and also like War and Peace. And so I always loved both page turners and sometimes unbearably slow novels. So and again, especially with an AI narrator who doesn't quite understand humans or humanity yet, but is trying to. I felt like I had the space to really lean into taking longer in scenes, putting in things that um, the reader might want to skip over. I really love just as a writer of language. I used to be a poet. Repetition, like when I see a sentence that repeats the same word or the same word appear, often copy editors are like, let's change that word because we can't use the same word in the same paragraph. And I just find that so silly. Like, um, I don't understand why we have that, especially if it's used intentionally, right? Can we? Um, I used to struggle with colors a long time ago, but then Carl O. What's the guy's name? He wrote My Struggle, I think.
Guard.
Yes, yes. I realized he uses like red, blue, yellow, and he says that again and again, and it's so powerful and evocative that I gave up trying to find unique words for colors.
I have a question actually about the narrator. And I have to couch it. I'm sorry. Like again, I'm leaning into a cliche here, but uh I I want to try to think about this novel's narrative style in relation to James Joyce's Ulysses. So can I first ask if that was if Ulysses at all was an influence for certain sections?
It's on, I haven't read it. It's on my list of, books to read, but yeah, I have not read it yet.
That's so striking because like there's so Ulysses of course like I mean it has this thing where like it changes narrative styles every chapter after a certain point or almost every chapter. And the 17th chapter called Ithaca is like the climactic chapter of the novel. And precisely at the climax of the novel, the narrative voice totally pulls back and it's delivered through a series of questions and answers. So like the narrator will say like which directions did our characters take walking home? And then it will give like a sort of computationally precise description. And mind you, this is like, I mean, yeah, this is in the beginning of the 20th century of like the exact trajectories, using purely technical terminology that the characters traced through the city of Dublin. There's a moment where the narrator describes exactly the contents of the main character's kitchen cabinet. And it's just like, one, mushroom, what's one mustache cup or whatever turned upside down with a chip on one end. Like like three, three half-ripe peaches or something. It's just, and it kind of, and then the most striking one is like, there's this part where the narrator gives a totally kind of dispassionate, again, sort of computer-esque account of the whereabouts of most, like, of the novelistic population. And it says, so and so in bed, like because this is all happening at a very precise hour of the day. It's like so and so is in bed, so and so is in bed, so and so is doing this, so and so is reading by, I'm sort of making it up, but like reading by their lamp. And then one character whose funeral was celebrated earlier in the novel is it's just listed as in the grave. And there's that amazing moment in Afterworld where the narrator lists like the different basically the in that case everybody's dead, but it's like describing just the location of each corpse essentially or if I remember right like yeah right it's like where they are where they're situated and how long they've been dead for or
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
um and I guess like part of this is just that I mean I know this is and again it seems that it's like maybe less germane to your novel, but like I just feel like Afterworld totally made me reframe how I read Ulysses, and I cannot but think of that chapter, from a book published in 1922 as a conversation between AIs, um, and there's something about like like this for Joyce that chapter is supposedly using a kind of scientific narrative style? Like, what if a scientist were a narrator or something, or what if science itself, the voice of science or the science textbook were a narrator? And it has similar moments also, like where the AIs describe, like the actual sort of exact physiological processes for as Sen does some kind of reflexive activity or reflexive bodily movement. It does that as well with in other contexts. And so I was just trying to think through like. Um, I mean, on the one hand, how does one produce a narrative voice like this? Like for Joyce, it would have been he wouldn't have had, AI, ChatGPT to like model it. But I don't think ChatGPT writes like this either. So like where, as you were, doing these lists, right, these inventories or these kind of clinical physiological descriptions, um, like, is that just coming from your head? Like, what are you channeling certain discourses or certain descriptive styles that exist out in the world? I'm just wondering about like how because they feel so convincing in Afterworld. They really do.
Well, I'm going to bump Ulysses up on my TBR, so thank you. That chapter sounds amazing. So when I decided to have the AI narrator, I did do a lot of reading about, I tried to understand to the best of my ability kind of the technical stuff behind large language models and neural networks. And somehow I ended up and that was years ago, so I can't even remember the connection. I took a lot of notes, but it led me to think, like this is how they would make sense of, I guess through data, they would make sense of the environment through data. And I brought this up before. It reminded me of, I've done a lot of reading on neurodivergence, and when I've heard how in one book they mentioned when someone who's on the spectrum or has autism enters a room, they're not going to focus exactly on people or things that neurotypical people think are important. They might find I don't know, the fan more important that's whirring, or like the wall is just as important as the person. And so I felt like an AI who is experiencing the world through data would have the same experience. So yeah, that's what I leaned into. I think naturally, especially as a speculative writer, I want my stuff to feel very realistic. So my style tends to be, I have lists in like all of my writing, and I love getting technical if I can about things that don't exist because I feel like that makes the reader experience them more. So it's probably a mix of my natural style, but I felt like I could really lean into it again, and then also just reading that I was doing and some thinking.
Do you ever get pushback on that kind of technical style?
Uh, I don't think. I mean, I tend to write long, or at least I used to, and that maybe that's one of the reasons. So that stuff probably could be the first to go if, I write a 13,000 word story and it's supposed to be 8,000 words. An editor might think I really don't have to go on for so long about whatever. But on the whole, if I stay within my word count, I think it's just written as a stylistic. I'm not a big, I'm not a traditional plot person, so I think a lot of my work that's kind of like the meat, the meat of the writing is the language and these objects accumulating.
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts if I can jump in here. I mean, so you mentioned the I guess like the kind of aberrant or rare focus of, like neurodivergence, right? Like, and it's funny because a lot of the stories that I get from certain members of my family when I was a kid is I would run around and we would be at a family party and I was always turning the lights on and off. So I would go lights, lights, like so like mentioning a fan is really funny. I think actually my mother made me a homemade Halloween costume and I went as a fan one time when I was like really young. But also, this kind of emphasizes too, like this has always happened in literature, right? Like much of literature is from a kind of impossible perspective, where an example that I always sort of think, or maybe not impossible, but unclear perspective, like, that kind of muddies the idea of who is speaking when they're speaking. I mean, of course, this is something that scholars have discussed quite a bit, but the example I always think of is Against Nature by Huysman. There's it's I don't know if you've read it, but it's a novel where the narrator protagonist is kind of this misanthrope who has a lot of money, retreats into this kind of aesthetic palace that he very carefully curates to kind of always have these works of art around him. And he like tries not to see anyone else. Like he's an aesthete basically, right? Like he's reading literature. He has all these paintings. He even I think he makes perfumes. There are all these things that he does, and there's a really crucial passage that's I think the kind of famous moment where he buys a tortoise because he has this really nice rug, and he thinks to himself like something needs to be moving in this kind of elaborately patterned carpet. Like if I could get something on there that's moving around, then it would really give me this kind of like aesthetic pleasure. And so he sends this tortoise out, and it comes back a couple times. He gets it gilded and he also gets it bejeweled, right? And he says, okay, finally, this tortoise is like shining and glimmering in the light against my dark carpet. It's going to be, beautiful. But then he kind of has this daydream, right, where he loses track of the tortoise. He he kind of just lapses into like reverie, and he actually has kind of an unpleasant daydream about this time he had to get a tooth pulled, I don't know, whatever. That's kind of neither here nor there, but there's like a two-sentence paragraph in the middle of all this, which is, again, a novel that's concerned with not only works of art, but I think, kind of mistaken idea that works of art can just engineer certain experiences for us, right? Which the narrators kind of bought into this idea. But there's this beautiful, like, two sentences where it just talks about how silently the snow is falling outside and everything, looks like crystalline or something. But it's not that cannot be, I mean, it's a third person narrator anyway, but it's like it's probably something that our narrator didn't even see. And so now, maybe kind of uh, connected with what you said, Nathan, like may, maybe there's some way that that novels have always kind of been written, if not by AI, by like a kind of consciousness that can see things that the characters can't see. I mean, I know this is just the idea of omniscience, but now, I mean, people have even, I can't remember who, but somebody at some point has said that, Proust's narrator was a floating eye, right? Like a character with no body, just a pure consciousness, like a disembodied consciousness. And it strikes me that in Afterworld, the story worker acknowledges, like, hey, I have no body, I can't touch Sen, and yet, you know what, I'm actually like stroking Sen's hair, right? Like the part with the graphs, especially, uh there was a bit of humor there, but that question that raises, I think, is really, poignant and really important for just reading in general, right? Like who is even writing this, right? How is this possible to be happening? So I guess that's just sort of a general comment, but that's something that I have been thinking about a lot with Afterworld.
Yeah, yeah. And often often I really like books that I don't know what the structure is called, but books that who it makes sense that there's a story being told on this occasion, and here's how the story is happening. I guess to bring up the Wall by Marlen Haushofer again, it's a person sitting down to write the last words that she's going to write, the last words any human is probably going to write. Um, or Afterwards, there's a story worker who's trying to the tell the story of the last human on Earth. There's something, I guess I feel like that's more honest than having the author pretending that there's nobody writing the book. That's just my own personal hang up. And I think it was temporary. I think I could go back but for a while I just felt like there was this dishonesty if I didn't try and have that frame around the fiction I was writing.
Should we transition here to the wall? It seems like a great segue.
I'm always up for talking about the wall. I'm so excited to I don't know if it's a book I give people, and I think I've made my book club read it, but haven't had a conversation about it for a while. So thank you for agreeing to read it and talk about it.
I mean, thank you for suggesting it. I'd never read it before, and now I'm like proselytizing all the time. I'm giving it to everybody else, you know. It's yeah, because it's such a fascinating novel.
Yeah, we both loved it, and I actually, so my undergrad advisor, Jeff Wallen, I mean, whatever, he's a specialist in a lot of things, but one of them is, German literature. And, I know Haushofer was Austrian, but I asked if he had read this novel, and he looked it up. He said, no, it sounds familiar. And then he was searching, and he said, oh, so I guess his cousin, co-ran the press that originally published it in English. So,
Oh,
like, New Directions, I didn't realize this, but the New Directions is like a republication, and it was published by a small press.
yeah,
Yeah,
Cleus Press. It
yeah.
was,
Oh,
yeah.
So his cousin, yeah, was like one of the people who ran that press, which is an interesting connection.
Oh, I might. So I have this dream, and I think I was thinking recently, I kind of want to figure out the history of the wall and why this small press decided how they picked it out and why they decided to publish it. And then why New Directions decided to give it the attention that it's getting right now. So maybe I'll ask to be connected with your if that's okay with your
Sure. Yeah.
professor's cousin. That'd be a great interview.
So do you want to maybe just talk a little bit about how you came across this novel? I know you mentioned, I think, in one of your emails that you try to read it, what, every couple years or every year or something like that. And I know that in one of the stories from Portalmania, I think a character mentions having read it 7 times or something like that. And of course, there are certainly parallels in Afterworld as well. But yeah, I think, curious to hear like how a little bit about your relationship with this novel.
Yeah. I came to it, I almost think it was out of print when I had this book, 100 Best Books by Women, that my friend and I were going through, and it was this wonderful time when I didn't feel like I didn't have pressure to read anything in particular, so we would just open up the book randomly and read whatever was on the page. So one of those books was The Wall, and I'm so grateful. Um, so we read it. I loved it immediately. I think it showed. I was thinking about speculative fiction at the time, starting to write it. I was writing more literary, like pure realism, and this for me was like, oh my God, I could write really slow, realistic speculative fiction because all the other stuff I had been reading was really plot driven. So this was, and really the wall, like why it happened is not the biggest concern. It's not really a concern for the narrator. We never really know. It has other things are more important, which I really loved. So it's kind of a foundational book for me as a writer. I'm very proud. I'm quoted on the back. I wrote of this edition because I wrote an essay for the New England Review, just comparing it to The Road, which I had read recently, and kind of thinking of The Road as like a male apocalyptic novel, and this as the female apocalyptic novel, where she's actually pretty. I also love that she was content in a way, right? And those scenes where she remembers her old life and finds motherhood and being a wife kind of lacking, I thought were really powerful. So that's when I first read it, and I've loved the book ever since. I definitely reread it when I was writing Afterworld just to get a sense of pacing and to get inspired. And I've just been so thrilled that it's like a book talk book now, thanks to New Directions and this cool new cover. And it gives me hope that readers are into it now. Like uh mainstream more mainstream readers who might find I would have expected them to find this book slow, but they're really connecting with it. So
Yeah, the slowness really jumped out at me. I mean, it's somewhat like Afterworld. This is I mean, maybe it's worth actually just giving a brief synopsis for the listeners who haven't yet gotten this hot literary find across their desks. But so anyone can correct me here because I'm terrible at plot summary. But this is about a woman in her 40s, right, who goes to stay with some friends in a cabin in the mountains in the woods. And one morning she wakes up alone and she's been separated from the rest of the world by an invisible wall, like literally a wall that she can't pass that seems impenetrable, that extends for an indefinite length. And she can see through the wall but can't cross it. And so she basically has to learn how to survive on her own. Um, and that seems like it would be, it's maybe it's sort of an isolation story, a survivalist story, a recipe for, grandeur or, fantasy and action. But it's really this almost this like doggedly like boring in a really beautiful way, kind of step by, intensely detailed step-by-step description just of how she goes about caring for the animals that she is with on her side of the wall. She has a dog, a cat, and a cow. And just her day-to-day sort of quotidian life, living alone in the woods, where other than this strange, catastrophic inexplicable event and change in her life and the state of the world. Like it really could just be a kind of, I don't know, like a journal of just a very intense stay in the mountains, you know. And I there's so much more going on sort of in terms of narrative style, point of view, right, even the type of documentation and description that's happening in Afterworld, but there is a similar, I think, wonderful focus on just the day to day, like what it's like day to day to exist in a body, in a way that is related, sort of obviously inspired by, called for by the kind of by the speculative scenario, but also is totally independent of that and stands on its own as just like an incredible account of what it means to be in a body, you know. And so I mean, that aspect of the wall just blew me away. Like I've never read anything like it.
I'll quickly chime in and just say that I was prepared not to dislike it. Like I expect I've heard both Chris and James, who does the Hermitics podcast, speak very highly of it. They've both done reviews. I should say Chris from Leaf by Leaf, who recommended your work to me in the first place. Um, but because I've only read a few Austrian novelists and obviously in translation, the most recent one being Thomas Bernhard, who is, he writes these long, I mean, people writing in German write long paragraphs anyway. I know, I just know this in general, but I expected it to be slow, I guess, but the way that it was slow was, I think, Nathan, as you were kind of alluding to, like really pleasurable. I mean, there's plenty of, and Nathan and I have worked together collaboratively around the idea of light. Like this novel has like beautiful descriptions of light, beautiful descriptions of just nature, trees. Um, but also, I mean, the relationships with the different animals were really touching, especially because I'm a cat owner, also who just recently had to put a cat down. So like the descriptions of the cats and I found myself a little bit choked up over some of the cat stuff. But one thing that jumped out at me that seems actually more than the thematically relevant stuff like the matches and you know uh the cabin in the woods, something that felt a little bit like formally relevant, and maybe I don't know if this is an explicit inspiration for Afterworld, but the idea that this novel is written, right? It's a report, right? She says at some point, I think, like it's a report, the narrator says, but the narrator also constantly refers to her diary or journal, which is something separate, right? So there's like the diary or journal, and she will say, like, oh, I was reading the diaries, I was looking at this, I looked in my diary and I couldn't remember when I wrote this. But yet what we get is not those diary entries, it's a separate almost as you kind of began by saying about Afterworld, right? It's a separate document, right? It's something else, uh, which I think does a lot for the way that maybe time works here. I mean, because time is also huge in Afterworld. And I don't mean this just to be a comment comparing your novel with this novel, but it's just something that I wonder if you've thought about or you have ideas about what that distinction is, right? Like we have so many novels with characters who are writers, but this character isn't, I mean, not a novelist, right? She's writing a report and she's writing in a journal, and those are two separate things. Like what are those two separate things? Like how do you think we're supposed to maybe approach the relationship between them?
Sure, because she's writing about her writing that she did in the
Right.
journal, right? Yeah, I really love that distance uh that we get. And I feel like one reason I love rereading this book is that I'm put in the same position as the narrator, where I know everything that's going to happen. I mean, I know everything, all the plot wise that she's going to talk about. There's this feeling of dread that I have that I don't think I had the first time, where you get all the little hints that she's referring to. There's this immense set. So I think one thing that allows the reader, especially on rereads, to be in the same spot that narrator is, where maybe if it was just the diary entries, we'd the first read we'd be more connected to the narrator too, but maybe that's more temporary connection. I I feel like this book is also kind of about the narrator's transformation. There's a lot of, I noticed on this reading, there's a lot of otherness happening, where there's one point where she mentions she has this blind mole inside of her, or just looking in the mirror and not recognizing herself, or feeling now she doesn't recognize who she was even last year. And so I find that again, that distance, this structure allows for that distance, which I think is important. Um, and it's not like she's seeing it as a loss either. I think she seems really comfortable, a little scared. I mean, there's some anxiety, but she seems really comfortable with the changes that have happened, and she knows there's going to be more changes. I really enjoyed the parts where she's talking about she wants to hide this report because who she becomes might want to destroy it or might not understand why it's important. Um, so there also is that, this encourages me to think, well, who's she going to be in the next year or two if she's changed this much in the last 2 years?
I love that last point. It's like I mean, it would seem like, so any first person narrator is often, been seen by whatever narratologist as really being two people, deceptively two people folded into one. And Brian, we talked about this on an earlier episode, actually, by another story by Bennett Sims. There's both the I who's narrating now and the I that the story is about. And that and I mean, maybe this speaks to what you were mentioning earlier, Debbie, about your sort of just like sort of intractable desire to motivate that doubleness, because otherwise it's just really, really unstable and weird. Like whenever you're reading a first person narrator that's unmotivated, you're often like, well, is this I speaking in the moment, or is this I speaking in the present, the present of narration? But you're pointing out that there's also the I of the future. Like this is sort of oriented toward the I that would actually seek to annul or negate the whole act of narration that's happening that allows us to read this book. Um, and that's sort of and antagonistic interplay between eyes or narrating eyes is really fascinating to me. I mean, one thing that as you pointed out, sort of the writing about one's own writing, it really reminded me of Robinson Crusoe. In Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, the same exact thing happens. Like, he's stranded alone, right? Whatever. Thematically, there's connections, but formally, there's actually an even deeper connection, which is that he, at one point, says, "Okay, now I'm going to read you my journal entries," and he's like reading you his journal entries, and you're like, "Okay, so now I'm in the journal, right? I'm reading the journal." But then there'll be stuff that he'll sort of extrapolate from the journal, and you're like, oh wait, no, okay, so he's talking about, like, we got a journal entry, but then he's also talking about the entry. And it's sometimes, as I remember, it's been almost 10 years since I read it, but like the reader's unsure if they're reading a journal entry or reading Defoe's or reading the narrator's commentary on the journal entry, that
Hmm.
these two things become ambiguous. In this case, my impression of The Wall is that the narr is actually there's an incredible commitment to the fiction of the report, such that we never think we're reading the journal. The journal we never get to see, which is itself fascinating. Um, but what that means, partly for the cultivation of suspense, is that like there is almost none, because since we're reading the report is simply here's her thoughts in the moment as she's writing this report, reflecting on her last 2 years. We have all these sort of proleptic gestures that just spoil things, important things that are going to happen later on, in a way that's sort of anti-plot, but very realistic, for the kind of document that she's writing. Because of course her mind would wander to things that have already happened to her. Everything is a continuum for her. It's all simultaneously present as just her past 2 years.
Mhm,
Uh,
mhm.
and so I admire that, and I'm fascinated by it. Like here, that there's a sense in which it's like Haushofer wants to motivate the fiction of the narration so rigorously that it actually conflicts with our immersion to some degree, and like, or if not immersion, our anticipation, of what's going to happen, what's going to happen to her character. Will she, like, or even the cultivation of mystery. Of course, the novel has that in spades, but in certain sort of more conventional areas of plot architecture, I feel like this book is pretty subversive when it comes to that.
Yeah, yeah, because we do know everything that's going to happen it'd be interesting to find that page number, but at least probably a third in, half in, I
Yeah.
think she reveals what's going to happen. So something else is drawing us through the book. Uh, yeah, it's not like what's going to happen next. What is
Yeah.
drawing us through? That is the first time I read this, and I think you guys have alluded to this. I was fascinated by this should be so boring. If I explained it to people or even to myself, like, why am I not bored by this? I'm not, especially then, I wasn't an animal person. I've had pets since then, but so I didn't even have that. Like, now I'm very moved by the relationships in it, but at the time, it wasn't even something that I understood. So, it's so skillful that I don't know, what kept you guys turning the pages of this book?
I'll just say really quickly that I was also, I mean, partly with the animal stuff, like Brian, you talked about, how it really got to you. And I'll just say that I finished the book in the morning, at like maybe 9 a.m. in the morning. And then I spent the rest of the day just like spending time with my dog because I felt I was so moved by it. And I was just like, okay, I'm going to take her on an extra long walk. I'm going to play with her whenever she wants. I was really like, I was pretty torn up by the relationships with animals here.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say, I think I mentioned this to Nathan. Like, I set myself, partly because before I opened the book, really, I thought it might take me a little bit longer to read. So I set myself kind of like in this funny way, I gamify my reading sometimes when I have a few things I'm reading at once. But I was like, okay, I'm going to read 25 pages a day, right? But usually it would be more like 35 or 40 or 50. And I would say, okay, I'm going to read another 5, 10 pages or something. So what kept me going? I mean, um, this is something I think about often, and I think if we Nathan, you and I at least, like if we interrogate what we study as, scholars and professors and stuff, I think like probably the best, or at least the things that I tend to find most compelling are things where uh not much happens, right? It's more like the actual kind of, and it's not, I don't mean the play of language in kind of like an avant-garde sense, because it's not quite that, but it's this kind of interiority, this kind of description. I mean, I already mentioned like the description of nature, the description of uh, light, but I think like for me, it's always description over action, right? If this was a book where something was happening on every page and I was on the edge of my seat in the sense that Debbie, as you said, there's a kind of dread like throughout this novel. Like we know, and we even get hints in this really kind of masterful way because it's not foreshadowing the way foreshadowing happens in other texts. The narrator will keep saying, "Well, this happened after Lynx died." Or this happened after, whatever other animal died, right? Most of them end up dying, right? But we don't get the really tragic moment. Like the tragic moment is not the wall coming up. The tragic moment comes at the very, very end of the novel. And because you mentioned the road, it kind of strikes me that, I mean, it's been a while since I read The Road, but I do love McCarthy. But I didn't like The Road because the end of The Road feels like this redemptive, positive moment, whereas here, the end of The Wall is, this kind of I don't know, cap on the story, right? We have this tragic moment and then it just kind of ends. There's no quest, there's no uh, real resolution. And it almost reminds me of a line that I thought was really beautiful in Afterworld, which is in a different context. I think it's in the context of a kind of maybe panic attack that Sen has kind of early in the novel, but it's a way that I've often, or it's a nice way to articulate something that I've kind of felt about fiction sometimes, which I think the line is that feeling again of having to exist inside a narrowing channel leading to a dead end. Right. So there's a sense in which like fiction is totally just like every work of art, right? It's arbitrary where it begins and where it ends, right? The author makes that decision, but then when we read it, um we don't usually end with a they all lived happily ever after, right? We end with this hard stop of which I've come to see more now as just the end of me writing. Like me, the narrator, is done telling you this, right? It's not I'm dead, it's not the story's over. It's I'm done writing, which here in the wall feels pertinent because we have someone who's writing a report. She's out of paper, so there's this extra kind of layer of chance or kind of randomness to when the story even ends, which I think totally subverts the idea of like a regular apocalyptic story where she'd be what, trying to scale the wall or bash through the wall with a hammer or something, right? And I wonder, I mean, because I haven't read, I think, too much apocalyptic fiction, and I'll have to confess too that I'm not like a huge, I mean, this is a little different, but I'm not a huge fan of science fiction, though I would at another point, I'll ask you for recommendations because I am kind of trying to be, especially because my students seem to like it a lot. But is this something, like in terms of reading, being a reader of apocalyptic fiction, like how do the endings usually go? Because I'm, curious about I guess how unique or how unexpected the ending of The Wall felt, right? Like, is this something that do we usually get a positive ending? Do we usually get a negative ending? Like what? I don't know. I mean, this is a general
I
question.
think I think that it is a bit random, the wall's ending, which it's really quiet. Uh it's a little, I feel like maybe that last sentence is a little performative, which I don't feel like at all the rest. So maybe it's not my favorite last sentence. But but yeah, it's a really quiet ending. I think in other post-apocalyptic, they do tend to kill off characters that you like. So I mean that's I guess something connection. There is often some tragedy. Um, but I think I was shocked. There's a post-apocalyptic novel, The Girl with All the Gifts. It's like a real I'm not into zombies, but it's kind of like The Last of Us in some way where the virus novel. And I was shocked at what they did at the ending because it was so rare to like have a it's like a nihilistic ending almost. And I think generally it's more like The Road where there is some hope. Um, Even if it's not because post-apocalyptic novels are really about survival. They're not about humanity ending, which what I with the wall, she makes that big decision with the gun at the cabin, and I feel like she's kind of just she's decided to end. I thought this reading, she decided to end humanity in a way because the her and the man who they probably could have continued to hatch kids, and continued on, but she she decided to. So essentially humanity's extinct, I guess, at the end of this novel. But it's so much quieter than that, I think. So I did also want to say, Bryan, what you mentioned that the real tragedy in this book is not the wall. I found that to be really moving and amazing. Like I felt so much more deeply the loss of these animals than the loss of the entire human race, which is just such a feat of writing.
It is. I completely agree that that's a feat of writing, and yet it did ju literally just now occur to me that I feel isn't it often the case in fiction that actually we don't we don't really care about mass human slaughter or even about the death of characters, but the death of animals is like it's maybe rarer. You know, people remember animal deaths in the way that they don't remember character deaths, let alone population deaths, which is already kind of anti-narrative in its way. Um, I taught a class on violence last semester, and we one of the texts, was the movie John Wick or the John Wick franchise, and we talked about how these movies are all about this guy who goes on a rampage because the goons killed his dog, and it's sort of a tongue-in-cheek or jokier version, but like there is something to, I mean, the implication there is that like the very fact that that could be a hook of this movie means that it's like, yeah, this is way more serious than those other revenge movies where your whole family gets killed, or your whole family gets tortured. Um, so I wonder how that would fit into sort of that sort of convention would fit into this novel. I mean, obviously, a novel written much earlier. This is from the 1960s, right? And I don't think the genre of sad animal movie, really existed. I don't know if what's the precursor to like what are those movies about like Marley and Me or something like where an animal dies.
Where the
Um,
Red Fern Grows.
yeah.
I
Oh yeah,
feel like that
yeah,
was maybe 70s, 60s.
yeah, yeah. That's a good
Very,
one.
very sad.
But
Uh,
isn't this also, I mean, I don't know about either of you, but this is something that I've often thought about, as like I always had pets. I have pets as an adult, as a kid I had pets and uh, not that when I've experienced, loss of relatives or things like that, not that I wasn't sad or wasn't like really, really shaken by it, but there's something really specific about, I mean, again, recently having to make the decision to put an elderly cat down and being there and watching that happen. There's something about that that is very different from uh, even losing a friend, right? Or even losing someone to an accident or someone who passes too soon or whatever. I'm not saying it's worse. I'm just saying that there's something really particular about that, and I wonder if it's uh I don't know if there's an answer for it, but I think that it's employed and kind of even though there's this restraint, there's almost like this emotional restraint throughout the book, we still feel those losses as really kind of, just brutal. Because we know that everyone else, not only everyone else, but every other animal in the world is dead, right? So everyone who's beyond the wall is dead. We even, we repeatedly see the kind of statuesque, people frozen in place who eventually fall over or get snowed under or whatever it is. But, you know, even when I think it's one of the kittens, dies, it's just like a totally earth-shattering scene, but it's not written about. And Debbie, I think you're right. Like the final line feels like it does feel performative. It feels like it's trying to end on a poetic note that it doesn't need or something, like it almost would have been better to end a little more mundanely or something like that and just kind of leave us with the lingering unease of the ending. But even, even when the first kitten dies, it's like, wow, like we don't have that poetic description of the kitten's death. It's just this kind of like thing that exists. Uh, and we just read over it and it for a few pages you just kind of feel, awful, awful about it, right? I mean, it's yeah, I don't know. I don't think that's only an artistic thing, right? I think that's like a response that at least I have. I'm sure a lot of people have with pets. Like I remember my final little anecdote. I remember in high school we had in a history class we had to watch some, biographical film about I want to say like, Louis the 14th or whatever, right? And the whole or it was about Versailles and it was, the point that was being made was that there's so much extravagance, so much waste, this is so uh irresponsible at the same time as being kind of like a sign of wealth and power and all of this. And the scene that really got to me is that I forget what they were trying to achieve, but there's a horse that drowns, right? And that was supposed to be like the moment that shows you, at least, as the viewer, like this is how little they care, right? But I'm sure at the same time there were, peasants or poor people dying every day, right? People being slaughtered in wars and things like that. But there's this scene of like of that kind of yeah, I don't know what to describe it as, but it feels like really there's a lot of pathos in those kind of moments.
I feel like she has some wonderful lines about motherhood where I feel like that relationship to her children is kind of being compared to her relationship with her animals. And she mentions she was a good mother to her children when they were really young, but then they grew up and they didn't need her anymore. And I feel like the relationship with her animals, they always need her. Like it's almost like there's almost like a child, like there's definitely she feels responsible for protecting them. To me, this with this read, it felt like it was about our inability to protect the things we love. And I know the narrator talks about how she'll be relieved when all the things she loves are dead, because then she won't have to. I think it causes her a lot of stress, a lot of responsibility. But Yeah, there's this, I think that it's not, it's maybe it's a less complicated, more pure love between human and animal in some ways, where I think they're always going to depend on the human in this way that is beautiful.
Yeah. Can I ask a pretty crude question? I'm like a dogged literalist in reading, I guess, and often in life. But like, do we have any idea of what the wall is? I have thoughts about the wall, the kind of the physics of the wall as they relate to games, but I'm just wondering, like, is the novel suggesting that it was a kind of weapon, right? Or but like bio weapon almost or something? Yeah,
I feel like it has to be human made for this for the concept to work. Like if it was just a random, I think it's kind of a it seems very critical of humanity's propensity to violence. So there's that section where she talks about she's waiting for victors to come, right? And
right.
then she questions like it seems like there's not any victors. But so I imagined it was, and this was written during the Cold War, right? So maybe it was a weapon gone wrong by some force. Um, what did you think though?
So I kind of, again, I think it's an open question, but when I was reading, I thought that I see what you mean, like the idea of the wall, or the narrator's idea of the wall being a human construction, could be and probably should be read as being critical of humanity's propensity for violence. But I also like wonder if it's critical just simply of our like tendency to try to find an explanation, which it seems that, especially with the slowness of the book and the narrator's pretty quick adaptation to this kind of life, feels, I think for me, like a little bit more actually, it reminds me of a moment in Afterworld where there's, I think it's the narrator purely speaking, talking about how, it's read these apocalyptic novels and has realized that that's not actually how we act when there's an apocalypse, right? Like at the end of the world, we just get into our routines and we have the same petty stuff, and we're not always having these brilliant realizations. We're just kind of trying to survive, right? We're trying to surely after after a certain point we have to uh deal with the shock of whatever's going on, but eventually we sort of settle into a rhythm, and that seems to be partly the thing that gives our narrator like the strength or whatever, the fortitude to live for this long as the last person on Earth, like much similarly to what happens with Sen. um but yeah, I don't know. I think that's like a I think I read it as being like ambiguous, but I like to think that it's kind of a comment on our tendency to try to explain things away and assign meaning to certain things.
I really love that reading of it, Brian. With Afterworlds, I did not want to explain why the virus happened, and I got a lot of pushback, like polite pushback, but along the way because uh, it just seemed like the reader was, it was implied the reader would get frustrated and not be able to handle that. But it really like it isn't the biggest issue for the narrator. So I kind of like that where you're making a good like why does it matter? The reason. I mean, I think it's a good question, Nathan, but I like yeah, I like thinking how unimportant it is to the narrator and how important it is to us. But what did you think, Nathan, about the wall?
Well, I have two thoughts. I mean, one, you mentioned the release of S, the virus in Afterworld, which is in an another sort of ingenious aspect of that book is that everything is dated relative to the release of S. So we no longer use the calendar that we're familiar with. It's S, either S plus 148 days or S minus, 2000 days. Um, and I think one of the masterstrokes of the book is precisely that we never find out why or how S was released, the sterilization virus. And that felt really real. It's like when in a time of total crisis and extinction, like the channels of information are also going to go down too. So it's like none of that will matter, and also you're probably not going to be able to find out anyway. It was one of the if there was one of the things about Afterworld that just struck me as feeling, despite the kind of extremity of the scenario, um, it felt just so palpable to me in a way that was really bracing. Um, for the wall, I mean, I agree. Like it was a bit of a facetious question, and that I don't really particularly care what the explanation for the wall is, but I do think it's a fascinating fictional object, or fictional conceit. And partly this is again reading anachronistically, in the same way that I often read anachronistically, honestly. But video games are full of invisible walls. It's in fact, they're actually called by developers and gamers invisible walls, which are essentially artificial boundaries that characters can't pass through or the player can't pass through. Um, and I was very stuck reading this book about the differences between how and the similarities and differences between how invisible walls work in games and how the wall works and the titular wall works here. Um, One key difference is that so in a game, an invisible wall, again, this is about the sort of construction of space. And my sense of invisible wall is that it's a kind of solution for the problem of how to limit player traversal because any game space needs to be necessarily limited when there's no story world or diegetic excuse. So oftentimes a bush, right, will be a limitation for you can't walk past the bush. The bush just blocks you, or a door, right, or an actual physical wall or building or trees. Game worlds are furnished with all of these physical objects that can supply sort of diegetically or naturally motivated reasons for why you can't traverse them, even if they're a little bit far-fetched. Like you still need some suspension of disbelief because, of course, a character can still just jump over the bush, but they can't. Right. But sometimes if you're modeling a space that does not have these kinds of objects, right, obstacles, say you're modeling just a desert, you can't then produce the entire desert in the game. You need to have a boundary somewhere. And so sometimes it's just a wall. Like the player runs up to the wall and they just can't you can't get past the wall. Um, but in a game, sorry for the monologue here, but in a game like those walls, part of the conceit is that they can't be recognized as such. Like they can have no physical reality, and because they're kind of stopgap solutions, they can't even have any trace of like, yeah, real existence. Whereas the wall is all too real. Like not just because it has story consequences and consequences for the narrator's life, but because it actually kills things. Like we have the scenes of like detritus from the storm piling up on one side of the wall, such that the wall itself becomes weirdly a real wall because there's like a wall of crap, that's abutting it. Or birds hitting it, right? Animals die from the wall because they crash into it, so there's a sense of like just the kind of stubborn, brutal, violent reality of this invisible, again, object. And so I was really struck by, or I sort of was very attuned to any moment in the novel where the walls, um, uh, again, sort of sheer physical reality was certified and had sort of tangible, often destructive effects on the environment and on living creatures. The last thing I'll just say is that just as in a game like, this is more one similarity than one difference, but in a game, um, I don't think it's common to see it happens, but like in an adventure game, for instance, it would be weird to see another character, like an NPC, a non-player character, on the other side of an invisible wall, because it would again sort of further prod the player into thinking, well, why can't I go talk to that person? Why can't I interact with that person? So it's almost like the other side of an invisible wall is de facto uninhabited or dead, right? Or sort of a space of extinction. And it's weird, like it's really cool how, I mean, first of all, you never quite understand, what is going on with those petrified or frozen bodies that the narrator sees. But it's like on the one hand, we see these bodies. So if this were a game, you'd be like, oh, that's interesting. Can I go check out that body? Like, let me go get some environmental storytelling. Like, let me go find an audio log or a dictionary or something and read about what happened. Such that it's sort of anti-game like. And yet it's precisely that they're weirdly frozen and in a kind of unfantastical or sort of totally wrong or deviant way and clearly inanimate that the kind of brute inanimate nature, the kind of spectacular deadness and non-humanness of these people or things on the other side of the wall makes them quite fitting in a way because it's like, yeah, like anything in a game, like anything on the other side of a wall again is de facto dead. So that was it's a powerful allegory for spatial design in games, even though it's of course has nothing to do with that. But it is really fascinating to think about it. I would love to give this book to game designers and just hear what they, pick their brains about it and like hear what they think, especially designers today working on sort of these elaborate, realistic 3D spaces, that could be an entire mountain valley, modeled down to the individual leaf.
That's really cool. It's a cool read on it. Do you think the wall, and this is again kind of, it doesn't really matter, but she mentions that the wall only goes up so high because clouds pass over it. And then she has this idea that she's going to be able to dig under the wall.
Yeah.
Like it would only go, because what does water seep? Does she know water seeps under
Yeah.
it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it seems like she's right that she should, if she digs far enough down, uh, it's interesting that she hasn't tried yet.
Yeah, that was one part that also just struck me as really weird. Again, like it's productively and it's interestingly weird, but my thought, again, I'm such a literalist. I was like, well, okay, if you're going to erect and if you're a Cold War power and you want to whatever gas an entire landmass and protect part of it by an invisible wall, like erecting this wall would seem to entail having it go really, really high and really, really deep, because otherwise you're just tracing like a shallow contour of the topography. Because if water is seeping through the stream underneath it, the wall can only be like, you know, 10 feet, 15 feet deep. Um, and so it behaves in fact like like a wall that was built by hand, where each component of the wall actually had to be dug into the ground, honoring the natural shape of the landscape. Whereas it seems like this is a magic wall that sort of blasted up overnight. So it's like, how did it blast up and also honor the topography of the landscape? I mean, I was just like very stuck on this in a way that was like, man, that's a weird ass wall. I don't know, like what's going on with that wall?
And if there was gas on the other side, like why is it not a dome?
Exactly.
Maybe could it be a dome? Does she know it's not a dome?
She sees birds flying overhead, right? Doesn't she see that? But in that case, it could be a dome.
Yeah,
Yeah,
unless the birds
you're right.
land,
Yeah.
I suppose. Yeah.
But she speculates, I think, at one point that maybe that it must. I guess maybe she just says it's not endless or something like that because she can. Or no, I think she sees clouds.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Clouds are able to pass to and from. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, the book is so realistic, other than the wall, the wall, right? Uh,
I'll put that in my Goodreads review.
Well, I'm glad you just said that, Debbie, because this is something we think about a lot, at least recently on the podcast in the context of games, which is like what makes a game realistic, right? It's not photorealism, it's not good graphics, it's something else about the experience of it, whether that's the player or the narrator or character's experience, but also I think ours, like I know that I'm pretty sure this has been adapted into a film, which I haven't seen, but I would imagine if somebody adapted it today, right, and maybe wasn't caring too much about, you know, uh, staying loyal to the text and maybe just wanted to make something that was intense in, in the way that we tend to think about, television or film, we would have had at least one scene where she's like slamming against the wall repeatedly and trying to like smash it with things. And there's this whole long, what am I going to do? How am I going to break through this wall? But there's kind of like no question of that, which I think is what's really I mean, part of what's really beautiful about this novel, like it's not passive acceptance. I mean, the wall is still a question and a problem, right? But it's also not uh an enemy or something, right? It's not something to be defeated, right? Which I think is like the kind of basic plot structure we might imagine if something like this happened. Um, which again, I think this is what makes this like a really singular novel. I mean, it kind of now that we're talking more about it makes me think of Kafka, for example, like things kind of going unsaid or like the most bizarre thing ever happening, but it's kind of like unremarked upon by the characters, right? It's like, but that's not, again, I think the important point is that that's not just laying down and accepting it. That's just a totally different attitude toward whatever weird thing is happening, whether it's the wall or, turning into uh a giant vermin, or however they translate it in Kafka's Metamorphosis. But I actually I have another question, because at I think when you suggested that we read this novel, you mentioned thinking that it could be like a good game, like it could make it for a good game or something. Maybe I'm mistaken, but I think you maybe said that in one of your emails. And I was just wondering, like, what if you had the capabilities to make whatever kind of game you wanted, like what kind of game, what would the gameplay of The Wall be, do you think?
I'd be interested in a game that kind of like Afterworld, a game that wasn't fun. There's a game that I did a deep dive on called That Dragon Cancer. It was the game designer lost his son to cancer and then decided to build a game about it. But there was one scene in the game where you're supposed to comfort the son who's crying uncontrollably, like really loudly. And you can't comfort the son. Like I can't remember what you're supposed to do to have the game move forward. You might have had to put the son down, but like there's no way. And anyway, there's no way to even win the game because the son's going to die. So I'm interested in just like books that are uncomfortable, games that are uncomfortable. And so I think a really slow game where um it's just this woman's existence that you're kind of going through. Uh, it'd be weird to feel like you're in control of the character in this game. So I don't know if it would be, if you just observe it though, it's more like a movie, right? So what would the player's role be in this? Maybe the animals. Maybe the player could be one of the animals. I actually think that'd be cool. Lynx, maybe. Um, because that's more you're following the woman then, right? And kind of observing. And okay, so that's what the gameplay would be. You'd be one of the animals. Maybe you could choose, but I vote for Lynx. Yeah, that's a fun question.
I love that.
Can I maybe just ask, like, maybe, unless anyone has any more on the wall, like a final question, maybe a sign off style question, which is that, and I apologize, we haven't discussed Portalmania at all, which is your excellent new collection that just came out. But um, I guess my final question is, what's next? What are you working on? What are you thinking about? I know you mentioned um, possibly collaborating on a game around one of your recent stories. So I'm kind of curious to hear a little bit more about that, if you can share.
Yeah, I am supposed to be working on a novel that will end up as a print book, but I'm also really interested in other forms of narrative. So I reached out to a indie game designer, it's Abstract Machine, who does point and click 90s style games, which is the kind of games that I played. And they're unsettling in a way that I think would be great for Portalmania. So they are taking a look at the Portalmania stories. And it sounds like we're gonna go through with that to just do like a free game release collaboration. Um, I would love to. I actually did dream about learning to teach myself to program and to make games, but um, I think that would take a long time. So I think I'm going to keep seeking out to see if there's any people who want to collaborate with games. I play a lot of board games, but I'm kind of more interested in video games. I think because it just seems like there's a lot of narrative excitement, right now with them. And I think people are doing cool things. And it seems like the indie structure is really strong. So like there's tons of ways to release games where you don't have to go through um, corporations, but you could still have access to players, where I feel like in the book world, you could go the indie publishing route, but it's really hard to reach readers. I mean, you get many fewer readers. So yeah, I'm excited about that idea. And in terms of what I want to write, I think some kind of non-human narrative. So I haven't quite figured that out yet. I'm interested in, I think I just want to read like about whales and other animal intelligences and consciousness for a while and um, see kind of figure out what animal interests me the most, or is it plants, or is it the forest, and then figure out what kind of story I want to tell. It's all very vague, but I'm excited to. It feels like for the first time in years and years, I'm at a spot where I could choose a new interest in a new project, which is a really cool place to be.
That's super exciting. And we're just, yeah, again, just so grateful for you, to you for coming on the podcast and chatting with us and introducing us to this amazing book.
This was a lot of fun. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you both.
Yeah, thanks a lot for your time. It was great chatting.